All right, this is the STEELDIVE 1970. SD 1970. This is a copy of a Seiko 6105, also known as the Captain Willard, because it's worn by Martin Sheen's character in Apocalypse Now. Again, these came out in approximately 1970. Being a popular watch in Vietnam, it made sense that it was worn by Martin Sheen's character in Apocalypse Now. Seiko still makes and sells the Captain Willard today. Obviously, it's been in and out of production a few times. I'm sure there's been a few changes. Think of it like a re-release, probably a re-release by this point. But it's basically the same watch. You can buy it from Seiko, except it costs about $1,700 Canadian. This STEELDIVE cost me $80. These normally go for about $150 Canadian. I could argue even at that price they're spectacular value, but I got it on sale, like a Thanksgiving sale. I brought it down to $105, and then just the way Aliexpress works, there's, always additional coupons as you spend so much. And it was my first time buying anything from Aliexpress, so they gave me a coupon for that. Ended up bringing it down to $80 Canadian, including shipping, which is just insane. This thing is a spec monster for the price. So this is my initial look at it. I'm seeing it for the first time on camera, as you are. I ended up ordering the green version because green is my favorite color, despite knowing that, black would have been a safer bet. If the green is too bright or too shiny, it could look cheap. Official Seiko has a very dull or subdued color. It's like an olive green, and it gives it a vintage look, and I really like that. But this one's a little different, and again, in the official pictures, it looks really bright and shiny. But you got to remember, a lot of times those official pictures, they're in under like extremely bright white lights. I would say in the user pictures, if you look under the reviews, or if you Google the watch, look at video reviews, it looks better than the official pictures, and that's often the case. Like I said, black would have been a safer bet. It's harder to screw up black, and it suits a lot more different strap colors better. So if you're going to put this thing on NATO straps or leather straps, different colors is going to look better with black. But yeah, having seen this in person now, getting it out of the package, kind of in between what I was expecting. It's definitely not as bright and shiny as the official pictures look, but keep in mind we are looking at it under bright white LEDs again. So we'll take a look at it under some warmer lights as well. Comparing this STEELDIVE 1970 to the Seiko 6105, or the Captain Willard, they have a lot in common. Both are made out of stainless steel, obviously. Both are 200 meters water resistance. They both have a screw-down crown. They both have a screw-down back. They both have full lume, including the bezel. They're both Sapphire. Oh, and the kicker, they're both running a Seiko movement. Both are automatic, both hack, both hand wind. The Captain Willard uses a 6R35. It has a 70-hour power reserve. The STEELDIVE here is using a much more typical Seiko NH35 with a more common 41-hour power reserve. So yes, the movement is more advanced in the $1,700 watch, as you should expect. But the NH35 is a very common movement. It's used in a lot of watches because it's accurate and it's reliable. Of course, this watch is a homage. You could call it a clone. You could call it a replica. You could maybe call it a fake. You might have an issue with that. You might not. Again, this is a watch that Seiko designed, and you could argue that their research and development, or their paying for designers, is partially what you're paying for when you buy the real brand. But at the end of the day, you could buy 18 of these steel dives for the price of the Seiko. I'm going to compare this, instead of comparing it to a $1,700 watch, I'm going to compare it to my Seiko 5 Sports. It's a 5KX, as they call it. It's sort of looks like a dive watch, but it's not really a dive watch. That's another story. These normally go for like $350 Canadian. I paid $260 for mine. I think they're a little bit cheaper right now, like $250. So we'll look at it as a $250 watch. They have the same Seiko movement inside. They both have the 3 o'clock crown. They both look like dive watches, but that's where the similarities end. Okay, the Steel Dive's got a screw down crown. The Seiko doesn't. It's signed on the Steel Dive. The Seiko isn't. The Steel Dive's 200 meter water resistance. That's what most people would consider a dive watch. The Seiko isn't. It's only 100 meter water resistance. Again, it's not a screw down crown, and it is not 200 meter water resistance. So it looks like a dive watch, but it's not really a dive watch by what most people would consider a dive watch. This guy is Sapphire. The Seiko is not. It's using Seiko's proprietary hard lux, which is, honestly, it's good, but it's not going to be as scratch resistant as Sapphire. This has got a lumed bezel. The Seiko does not. This has, believe it or not, solid links in the bracelet. They both have solid links in the bracelet, but this has got solid end links. The Seikos, they're like stamped or hollow end links. And this even has a, solid machined clasp. The Seiko is, of course, stamped. Now, I think this is something that they've upgraded recently on the Steel Dive 1970. So if you've got an older version of this, you might have a stamped clasp. But from what I had seen, newer versions were coming with a machined or milled clasp, and this one did. So I was pleasantly surprised to see that. I would even argue the bezel action. You know what? I don't have to argue it. It is. The bezel action is even better on this Steel Dive. And I've always thought the Seiko had an okay bezel action. No, it's certainly not as good as my Orient Komatsu. This is almost as good as the Orient. It is definitely better than the Seiko. I think the Steel Dive also sits a little bit lower on the wrist. Maybe the back doesn't protrude as much as the Seiko, although that's more a factor of the design of the particular models here and not so much the brand. Again, this Steel Dive is a clone of a Seiko design, so that's got nothing to do with really the watch or the brand or the build quality. It's just the design they're based on. This is just a damn nice watch. Spec for spec, the Seiko has no chance. And that's not uncommon. Microbrands usually give you more for the money. It's just, with this, it's turned up to 11. The fact you're getting a sapphire crystal, screw down crown, it's signed, it's 200 meters water resistance, it's got a lumed bezel, it's solid end links, solid clasp, all that for $80 Canadian shipped is kind of ridiculous. So what does the Seiko have? Well, it has a nice looking dial and a nice looking handset. I like the design of the Seiko, and even with the Steel Dive, we have to give credit to Seiko for the design. Seiko paid for this design at some point, and Steel Dive just copied it. But also the Seiko says Seiko on the dial, and that means something. That is worth something. When someone sees my watch and it's a Seiko, they go, "Oh, nice Seiko. I love Seikos." If someone sees the Steel Dive and they go, "What's that? I never heard of it." Now I got to start explaining, well, it's an Aliexpress brand. They're really cheap, but, and that's just not as cool. I also prefer the 22 millimeter bandwidth over the 20 millimeter on the STEELDIVE. But again, that's a factor of the design of the model. It's got nothing to do with the brand. 22 millimeter bandwidth was probably not very common in 1970. And again, the STEELDIVE is a copy of a Seiko from 1970. I did have to adjust the bracelet, which isn't too common for me. I have pretty big wrists, and usually I just leave all the links in, and I can adjust the micro adjustments a little bit. On the Seiko, when I got it out of the box, I didn't have to take any links out. But on this one, I had to take 2 links out. So this thing will, if you've got like 9.5-inch wrists somehow, this thing will fit you. Very, very large bracelet. So yeah, I did have to take 2 links out. It's actually the first time I've ever had to remove links on a watch. So it was a bit of a learning curve there. I had to look up how that was done to make sure I was doing it right. The clasp also has 6 holes of micro adjustment, which is really nice. With 2 links out, I've got this thing kind of borderline. It's if anything, maybe a little bit too tight, but I do still have 2 extra holes of micro adjust left over. If I need to loosen it just a tad, I'll pop it over to the next set of holes. Take a look at it here under some warmer lighting. I have to say the green looks really good. It's definitely not as vintage as that Seiko's olive green, but it certainly doesn't look cheap by any means. And that was what I was afraid of, again, initially seeing, the product pages, images for it. It's definitely a very different green than my Seiko 5KX. Put them here side by side. You can kind of take a look. The Seiko's got a little bit more of a bluish hue to the green, I think you would say. But regardless, it looks good. It's a good green. It doesn't look too cheap, so I'm happy with it. All right, let's check out the Lume. I can already see in this darker room here that it's going to be pretty good. I can already see the bezel. But let's check it out in complete darkness. Yeah, nice. It's very bright, and I like that it has the 2 colors, like the green and the blue, to kind of differentiate the dial and the bezel. Compared to the Seiko, and honestly, Seiko is typically... they're a benchmark for good lume. It's not to say that their watches are always the best, but they're typically an 8 out of 10, and a lot of other watches get compared to the Seiko. The Seikos, for the price, usually have good lume. These are very similar. The lume on the hands and the indices, very similar. Similar tone, similar brightness. The Seiko has bigger hands with the way they're arrow-shaped. They're a little bit wider, and that lume kind of fills in the whole shape of the arrow, so there's more surface area. It's larger hands, and wider area where the lume is. So I think over time, as it got later through the hours, I think that the hands on the Seiko might hold out a little bit longer just because they're larger hands. But the STEELDIVE has that lumed bezel, and that's really nice. So I'm going to call it a tie when it comes to lume. The conclusion is kind of obvious here. The STEELDIVEs have been around for years. I've heard many people praising them for their value. So, honestly, no surprises here. This is a quality watch that would easily cost 3 to 4 times the price if it had a brand name on the dial. There's a reason so many people have praised these. I've only ever heard good things about them. I've had multiple people tell me I should check them out. I've always been aware of them. I've just never wanted to order anything off Aliexpress before. I've mentioned it before. I'm very impatient, and waiting like 6 weeks to get something just kind of pisses me off. But this sale was too good. I just couldn't pass it up. When I saw that I could get this for $80 shipped, I was like, yeah, it's time. It's time to check one of these out. And, you know, the fact is, if you don't care what the brand says on the dial and you like this kind of vintage 1970s design, there's a lot to like here. This thing is a spec monster, right down to that milled clasp. I've always liked the watch, and I'm never going to pay $1,700 for a real Seiko, so this is cool. Again, kind of obvious. The conclusion is obvious here. You've probably already seen a million reviews on this watch, and you've probably already heard a million people tell you about how great the quality is for the price and all that. It's true. Grab one if you want one. I'm not telling you anything you didn't know. I'm out of here. See you later.